When the Saturn V rocket carried humanity to the moon in 1969, it was hailed as a triumph of American ingenuity. But if we look beneath the gleaming white paint, we find a darker history. The architects of that triumph were not all homegrown heroes. In fact, many of them were former members of the Nazi Party, men who just years earlier had built weapons for the Third Reich. What's usually overlooked here is that this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated clandestine mission known as Operation Paperclip. Let's stay with what's certain. The records show over 1,600 scientists were brought to the United States. But at what cost? The story begins not in a laboratory, but in a bathroom at Bonn University in 1945. A Polish lab technician noticed a toilet was clogged with shredded paper. When he fished the pieces out, he discovered the Ozenberg list, a secret register of German scientists and engineers drafted for military research. This document became the blueprint for the American recruitment drive. And this is where it gets interesting. The Americans weren't just looking for talent. They were looking to deny that talent to the Soviet Union. Some historians argue this was a purely defensive move, a necessary evil to win the coming Cold War. Others suggest it was a predatory rush for intellectual reparations. Let's stay with what's certain. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was formed with one goal: get those men to America. But a massive obstacle stood in their way. President Harry Truman had explicitly forbidden the recruitment of anyone who was an active supporter of Nazism or a war criminal. On paper, the rules were clear. In reality, the rules were about to be rewritten in the shadows. When the dossiers of these scientists arrived at the desks of government officials, they were filled with evidence of Nazi Party memberships and SS affiliations. Under Truman's orders, these men should have been disqualified. But the GIOA had a solution. They began attaching ordinary paperclips to the files of the most valuable scientists, a signal that their records needed to be refined. This is how the operation earned its name. What's usually overlooked here is the sheer scale of the historical revisionism. Officials began scrubbing the records, removing mentions of the Nazi Party and replacing them with phrases like "not a committed Nazi" or "compulsory membership." Let's stay with what's certain. By the time these files reached the State Department, the war criminals had been transformed into harmless academics. Was this a rogue operation by intelligence officers? Or was there a tacit understanding from higher up that the rules didn't apply to the geniuses of the Reich? The documentation shows a deliberate trail of redacted truth. It was a bureaucratic shell game, one where the prize was the future of aerospace, and the stakes were the very integrity of American justice. Wernher von Braun was the face of the American space program, a charismatic visionary who charmed the public on Disney specials. But before he was an American hero, he was a major in the SS. Under his leadership, the V-2 rocket was developed, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. And this is where it gets interesting. The rockets weren't just deadly in their impact, they were deadly in their creation. Production took place at Mittelwerk, a subterranean factory where prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp were worked to death in horrific conditions. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by its explosions. Von Braun later claimed he was unaware of the atrocities, or that he was powerless to stop them. However, declassified memos and survivor testimonies place him directly at the site. Let's stay with what's certain. Von Braun was essential to the Apollo missions. Without him, the US might never have reached the moon in 1969. But we must weigh this against the reality of the 20,000 prisoners who perished in those tunnels. Was he a victim of circumstances, or a man who traded human lives for scientific progress? The records leave us with a haunting silence. While rockets took the headlines, another group of paperclip recruits settled into the American medical establishment. Among them was Hubertus Strughold, often called the father of space medicine. His research into high-altitude survival was foundational for NASA. But The source of his data is a matter of profound ethical debate. For decades, Strughold denied involvement in wartime atrocities. However, after his death, declassified documents linked him to experiments conducted at the Dachau concentration camp. These experiments involved immersion in freezing water and oxygen deprivation, tests designed to see how long a human could survive before dying. What's usually overlooked here is how seamlessly this data was integrated into American science. Some researchers argue the data was too valuable to ignore, that it could save lives in the future. Others believe that using the results of torture is a secondary crime. Let's stay with what's certain. Strughold's name was eventually removed from prestigious awards and buildings as the truth surfaced. But the question remains, can science ever be truly separated from the suffering used to obtain it? In the halls of American medicine, the answer was, for a long time, a quiet yes. To understand why the U.S. government took such risks, we have to look at the atmosphere of 1946. The alliance with the Soviet Union was crumbling, and the race for the next war had already begun. The Soviets had their own version of Paperclip, known as Operation Osoavia Kim, where they forcibly relocated thousands of German technicians in a single night. This created a desperate brain drain mentality in Washington. If the U.S. didn't take these scientists, the Russians would. And this is where it gets interesting. The GIOA argued that these men were intellectual reparations. Since Germany could not pay back its debts in gold, it would pay in genius. Let's stay with what's certain. The fear of a Soviet-led nuclear or rocket advantage was a powerful motivator. It allowed officials to sleep at night, believing that a few Nazi pasts were a small price to pay for national survival. But did this fear justify the betrayal of American values? Some argue it was a brilliant strategic move that won the Cold War. Others see it as the moment the U.S. lost its moral high ground. The archives show the panic, but they also show the pragmatism. For years, the American public knew almost nothing about the origins of the German experts working in Huntsville and San Antonio. The GIOA and the military-industrial complex launched a subtle PR campaign to humanize them. In 1949, Life magazine published a glowing profile of the scientists, portraying them as family men who loved classical music and hiking. What's usually overlooked here is that many of these men were still being watched by the FBI, even as they were being celebrated as symbols of American progress. Let's stay with what's certain. By the 1960s, many had become U.S. citizens and leaders in their communities. Their Nazi pasts were treated as an unfortunate, distant necessity of life under a regime. But was the public intentionally misled? Or was it simply easier for everyone to look forward rather than back? The truth remained buried in classified files until a new generation of researchers began to ask the questions the archivist is asking today. The story we were told was one of redemption. But the redacted pages suggest something more like convenience. In 1998, the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act finally forced millions of pages of documents into the light. These papers confirmed what many had suspected, that the U.S. government knowingly shielded men who had committed or overseen atrocities. We are left with two competing explanations for Operation Paperclip. One, that it was a regrettable but necessary strategic triumph that secured Western democracy against a communist threat. Two, that it was a moral catastrophe that proved the U.S. would sacrifice its own principles for technical superiority. Let's stay with what's certain. The footprints on the moon are, in part, the result of knowledge gained in the shadow of the Holocaust. And this is where it gets interesting. Even today, some files remain classified, some names remain redacted. The full truth of what happened in the corridors of power after 1945 may never be fully known. But as we look at the stars, we must remember the Earth from which those rockets rose. Was the moon worth the bargain? Or did we lose something essential in the race to get there? The archives are open, but the answers, those are up to you. History is rarely as clean as the textbooks suggest. Operation Paperclip reminds us that progress often comes with a price we aren't always willing to admit. If you found this investigation valuable, consider subscribing to Hidden Layer. We'll continue to dig through the forgotten layers and separate the documented from the speculated. Thank you for listening to The Archivist. Until next time, keep asking the questions that others are afraid to answer.